All right, so welcome to ABS and the Center for Free Economic Thought. First of all, I would like to thank the Austrian Economic Center in Vienna, Austria, with whom we've made this event together, and they made it possible to have this amazing panel with us today. I thank you to EBS also for hosting us in this beautiful conference hall. Today we will be discussing entrepreneurship, environmentalism, and energy from a principled perspective. Entrepreneurs drive the economy and are the source of innovation and economic value creation in society. The function is supported by ethics and economics, which call for a free market framework to operate at full capacity. Some of the more pressing social challenges, such as energy availability and environmental protection, could be best addressed by entrepreneurs operating in free markets with governmental protection of individual rights. Theory and history show that central planning cannot work, no matter what our politicians tell us. The alternative is the free market, where entrepreneurs recover their driving role in providing solutions that improve human life. Government intervention is a historical fact, and its relationship with the private sector is complex. Likewise, the educational system can actively support the free market with the right approach. So why and how entrepreneurs operating in free markets provide better solutions than today's central planners? How can government and educational sectors contribute to the efforts from a principled perspective? To engage rationally with these questions, we have this great panel of speakers and international thinkers. We have Yaron Brook, starting here, from chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute from the USA. We have our own Meelis, rector and professor of political economy at EBS. We have Martin Gundinger, who is senior research fellow at the Austrian Economic Center in Austria. And we have Mitja Steinbacher, dean of the Faculty of Law and Business Studies at the Catholic Institute in Slovenia. So without further ado, Yaron, please take it away. Thank you.
I'm going to just... Is this on? Cool. All right. So we live in a pretty amazing world. We live in a world, from a material perspective, of unbelievable abundance. We are richer than people 100 and 200 years ago could have ever imagined. Not only in terms of income or wealth, you know, by some estimate we make about 300 times what we made 200 years ago, but really in the intangibles that we can't really measure from a dollar perspective. I mean, how much do you value running water, flushing toilets, electricity, the ability to just flip a switch and have lights? Everybody today, particularly young people, I think, take these things completely for granted. They take the standard of living, quality of life, completely for granted. Indeed, they seem to think that they are born with an iPhone attached to their biology, that somehow it evolved naturally. But the fact is that all this wealth that surrounds us, all this abundance, or as J.J. McCluskey calls it, the great abundance, right, that we have today, is actually a product of entrepreneurs, of builders, makers, people with great ideas, people who are willing to take risks and work hard to create something that didn't exist before. People who are willing to go out there, out on a limb, take an idea, try it, often fail, try again, hopefully succeed. From about 200 years ago, when this really increase in wealth started happening, it is entrepreneurs that have led it. It is entrepreneurs that have created it and who have gotten almost no credit for it. If we think about wealth and income, for the longest time, if you go back, I don't know, 10,000 years, 20,000 years, doesn't really matter. You see almost no change in the level of wealth and income in human society. People made about $2 a day or less than that. Almost everybody, 95% of humanity. For thousands and thousands of years. You were born with the same stuff you died with. You know, today we're constantly waiting for the next version of the iPhone. Every day we're trying to make our lives better. And hopefully, if we're doing a good job at producing and at investing, we're becoming a little richer every day. That was not life for almost all of human society, almost all of mankind's history. That change happened about 200 years ago. It happened not accidentally. It happened as a result of the discovery of new ideas, of the scientific revolution, but primarily of a revolution in the way we think about individuals and about our world. It happened with the discovery of the efficacy of reason, the ability of individual reason to understand the world, and then the value of the individual. It happened at the time when individual freedom became an important value to all of us. And what does individual freedom mean? It means that you can go and act and do things in the world without asking for permission, without asking for the permission of the king, the council, the tribal leaders, the witch doctor, the priest, the authorities in charge, the government. The 19th century launched a period in which most of our activities in life are permissionless. We guide our own life. We decide how to act, what to do. And indeed, this period led to an explosion in entrepreneurship. Because for the first time in human history, really, people could come up with an idea how to use a steam engine to make a particular industrial process more efficient, and they could just go and do it. And if they were successful, they got to directly benefit from that success. And if they failed, they paid the cost of that failure. But usually, they just said, okay, I failed, I'll learn from it, and went on to do new things. If we look at every one of the achievements of the last 200 years, again, from a material perspective, we can see the role of entrepreneurs everywhere, from the steam engine, the application of the steam engine, to industrialization, to all of the industrial revolution and everything that it involved. Entrepreneurs built, created, made. If you think about energy, well, entrepreneurs are everything in the story of energy. Where would we be today? And I know some people think we'd be better off, but where would we be today if we hadn't discovered how to refine oil and create this cheap, unbelievably abundant source of concentrated energy that has changed the world? And who did that? It wasn't some government committee. It wasn't some authority. It wasn't some king. It's just entrepreneurs like ultimately J.D. Rockefeller who did it, who built refining capacity, who dug wells, who piped the oil, who built pipelines. J.D. Rockefeller ultimately saved the whales. Right? You know why they saved the whales? Because what was the main source of lighting before Standard Oil made oil really, really, really cheap? Kerosene, really, really cheap. Well, the main source of lighting was whale oil. Your ancestors in Scandinavia and around the Baltic Seas to go out and hunt whales in the hundreds in order to get whale oil, which rich people could then use to light their homes. It was very expensive. But Rockefeller, by taking that oil that oozed out of the ground that used to be considered what? A liability. Your land was worth less if you had oil on it, because you couldn't grow anything on it and nobody knew what to do with it. But people like Rockefeller, entrepreneurs like Rockefeller, took that and turned it into something useful, turned it into kerosene, which was then cheap enough that everybody could use it. You know, in modern times, again, some people think he's a villain, but the entrepreneur that created fracking, the ability to get natural gas and oil from places which you couldn't imagine getting it from. And indeed, one could argue that many of Europe's energy problems would be a lot smaller and a lot less dependent on Russia if Europe had allowed fracking to happen. Places like the UK are rich in natural gas. They're poor in fracking. All of this are entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs have created the modern world. They've created the technologies, the iPhone, everything we take for granted. There's some business mind behind them. And yet, they're often considered villains. They're often considered the bad guys. In the United States, we call the great entrepreneurs of the 19th century, anybody know what we call them? Robber barons. Robber, that means thief, crook, somebody who steals, and baron, an aristocrat, born with the wealth, born with legal privilege. Most of these entrepreneurs were born poor, certainly had no aristocratic title, and they created wealth. They didn't steal it. They raised a quality of life and standard of living. Indeed, how do you become rich in a free market? What is it that makes you, how do you become a billionaire? What's that? I didn't get it, sorry. Meme stocks. Yeah, very few people become billionaires, and certainly they don't stay that way, right? Not for very long. If you've seen how meme stocks have performed lately, how do you become a billionaire? Create a product that millions of people want and are willing to pay you more than it costs you to produce, and they want it over and over and over again. Now, why do they want it? Why am I willing to pay $1,000 for an iPhone? Because what? It's worth how much to me? More than $1,000. I won't go into how much more. I don't want you telling Apple. But much more than $1,000. So people buy stuff because it'll make their life better. So people buy stuff over and over and over again. It means they value this stuff. This stuff is good for them. They want to make their life better. So how do you become a billionaire? By making the lives of billions of people better. That's the only way in a market economy to become wealthy. It's by making other people better off. And in order to achieve that, you must use your mind, you work hard, you have to be innovative, creative, you have to have ingenuity, you have to be productive, you have to apply yourself, you have to exhibit real virtues. You have to use your mind. You have to be super rational. Go by the facts of reality. Can't become a billionaire by going by emotion alone. So being a billionaire or being successful in business, being an entrepreneur, a successful entrepreneur, requires real virtue. It requires making your life better and taking care of yourself and the people you love. And you cannot be successful unless at the same time you make the world a better place to live. And yet, we hate them. We despise them. We tax them more than we tax anybody else. If you have a progressive tax system, you're taxing them more than you tax anybody else. We call them robber barons. What's always questioned is the morality. But by every parameter of morality. They're using their minds, again, they're improving their own lives by changing the world and making it a better place. One could argue that not only have the entrepreneurs made the modern world, they've done it by exhibiting amazing moral character. So in my view, entrepreneurs are heroes. They're people to look up to and admire, respect, and want to emulate in whatever activity you live in life. And indeed, I think that for those of us who care about free markets, for those of us who care about wealth creation and want to live in an even wealthier world in the future, we need to find ways to articulate the case for entrepreneurship, not just from the perspective of economics, but from the perspective of morality. These are the good guys. If we're going to make the world a freer world, if we're going to have more free markets in the future, we're going to have to start viewing entrepreneurs as heroes. Heroes of production, but also heroes of morality. Thank you all.
Meelis, please.
All right. So, good evening. Welcome to Estonian Business School. I'm not sure if you have been here before, but I'm very happy to see you this evening. Estonian Business School is a private university that has been around since 1988. We have, in Estonia and in Finland, we have been there a little bit more than 10 years. So since we are at the university, and I was asked to talk about sort of the relationship between private and public, and I do basically political economy, teach political economy, then perhaps the best way at the university would be to start with sort of economics 101. Right? So we teach it here. This is something that is taught at many universities around the world. And when you enter the classroom of Economics 101, you usually talk that, well, look, in general, market works quite well, right? So most of the goods that we want, are provided by entrepreneurs. There is a private market mechanism, so most of the goods that are needed are the private goods, and they're all a result of the market interactions. However, there are also goods that maybe market doesn't always provide, and those are the goods that we call public goods, right? So you have, for some reason, you have sort of under provision of a certain type of goods, and there is need for sort of coordinated collective action through the government. So this is the basics, Economics 101. So you have private goods, you have public goods. In many ways, maybe they're sort of ideal types or idealized view of the world. So now you may also know that economists, depending on who you ask, they also get asked that, okay, give me an example of a public good, right? So what is a good example of a public good, right? And the answer might depend on whom you ask and to which university you go and so on. However, sort of like a standard answer usually has been the Lighthouse, right? So the Lighthouse is sort of the example of the pure public good. Okay? So this is quite sort of common, sort of established in sort of standard economics thinking for a long time. However, you may have heard of a guy called Ronald Coase, right? So he won the Nobel Prize in economics, by the way. And Ronald Coase wrote this essay in 1974, which was called The Lighthouse in Economics, right? And if you have read it or you're aware of it, then he basically showed how throughout the centuries, lighthouses were actually privately operated, right? So actually there was, so in that sense, it's kind of difficult to argue that it's a pure public good, right? So maybe there are sort of elements of public good, or you can provide also certain type of public goods through private means. And here at EBS, actually, by the way, Professor Kaire Põder, since he comes from Hiiumaa, which is the second largest island in Estonia, has also written a paper where he looks at the lighthouses, around Estonian islands, and basically come to the sort of the same conclusion that historically also they were actually provided often through the private means rather through the public purse. So we get this sort of confusion that maybe it's not that easy always to think of what are the pure public goods at least, and so that at least there's some kind of sort of issues with that. Some sort of other important points here, even if we agree that something is a public good and should be provided by the public means, then if you take example of policing, for instance, okay, you said, okay, policing, let's let the municipal government to provide it or some other government to provide it. However, if you look at some of the works by Ostrom, Elinor Ostrom, another Nobel Prize winner, you see that in early work in the 1970s, actually, she studied policing in LA, Los Angeles, and found that, well, policing was more effective in the neighborhoods where you also had neighborhood watch, right? So in a way, she sort of argues that delivery of the public good may also depend very much, what the private individuals do, how they collaborate and cooperate and so on. So in a way, it already becomes, what is my kind of research interest is sort of semi-public or semi-private. So it's not so clear what is there. And if you take it further, you may be aware that Elinor Ostrom and her husband, Vincent Ostrom, already in the 70s, in 1977, they kind of extended this concept of goods. They have this sort of typology of goods. So they're not just private and public, but you also have what we call commons, right? Later, Ostrom has this book governing the commons. And you also have a club or toll goods. So you actually get into this sort of much more complicated typology of goods that you sort of have to think about. And if you think about the environmental issues and energy issues, since I'm supposed to talk about those today as well a little bit, then I think this type of conceptual thinking is actually very important. If you think about the green energy transition that we want to undertake here in the EU, the European Green Deal, right? So there is a lot of talk on a sort of government or EU level, right? What we want to achieve. A lot of the public funds will be made available, but in the end, we cannot assume that it will be all delivered by the public sector, and public sector will make it happen, either through finance or through regulation and so on. At least this is semi-public, and it's complex semi-public, what they want to do. And in other words, it sort of means that you have to think about all those issues that sort of public choice and many other economic thinkers have talked us for many times. I mean, rent seeking, right? If you have lots of funds made available and incentives are not proper, you may end up with lots of rent seeking or sort of greenwashing, saying that, well, this is a green transformation, which is not. So we have to think really hard about what type of incentives we're creating. Are entrepreneurs willing to also contribute to this transition, or is it just something that happens in the public sector level and everybody is doing a nice kind of face and saying that, well, it seems to be working, right? Even here in Estonia. So in one hand, last year we had a relatively successful IPO by the government energy company, Enefit IPO. Very, quite successful in the sense that a lot of people participated. The share price is still higher than it was at the initial public offering. Seems that a lot of people were willing to finance that type of transition also through the private money in addition to the public money. But at the same time, we haven't really built any wind farms in Estonia for a long time, almost for a decade. Right? And a lot of the investments that Enefit, which is an Estonian company, does into wind farms has been actually outside of Estonia, in the neighboring countries. So, and why we haven't done that? There are a number of different reasons. I mean, one reason is obviously that, a lot of people are not sufficiently incentivized to have a wind farm close to their home, right? I mean, it's sort of not in my backyard or not in the, not blocking my sea view or that type of thinking. On the other hand, we also have had some other regulations that actually have stopped some of the entrepreneurs to set up wind farms. If you think about the national defense, the radar system was a big issue for certain entrepreneurs to set it up. It seems that there is at least some hope there in the sense that now the Aidu wind farm just had a bond issue, 150 million. So we'll see whether they will be able to succeed with that. But again, like other regulations, certainly do not make it easy for entrepreneurs, even if there is money is there, even if the will is there, to make it happen. And we actually currently also just conducted a study among entrepreneurs here at the Estonian, by the team at the Estonian Business School. And we got something like 500 responses. It's not public yet, so I cannot really go into details and tell what the entrepreneurs talked about green transformation, but certainly you can see from the answers that it's not a normal distribution, right? You have people who are on both extremes, right? You have people who are very knowledgeable and sort of want to make it happen. But then you have also people who are not aware what it sort of takes, and they sort of tend to think that, well, this is something that happens on a maybe government level or in a society level, but it doesn't really concern us, and what are we there to do. And my sort of final point would be that here at the Estonian Business School, so we're sort of thinking that how can we be useful in this process, right? So how can we help here? And I think the really key is that a lot of those businesses, they need to think about the new business models. And not just businesses, but also private individuals. How can I make this transition? And this is actually very complex. It's kind of like a micro level, individual level decision. It's not sufficient for someone in the government just to say that, well, this is the target we want to achieve, because it really depends on the specifics of the business, and it depends a number of other issues that on a very sort of macro level people may not know. So this is actually one of our focus areas, thinking about and trying to figure it out in our research, in our contribution to the education, how to help this transition happen, how entrepreneurs and individuals could be better incentivized in the whole process. So those are my opening remarks, and thank you.
So thank you, Meelis, and thank you, Yaron, for giving us the principles of morality of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs as heroes, a little bit about how the collaboration with government might actually happen, and we can go deeper into that later. We're going to go a little deeper into a topic today of application to the environment and energy with other visitors here. Next, if you want to go ahead, Martin. Thank you.
A few weeks ago, there was this news story that really caught my eye. It said that there were scientists that were really surprised when they tracked Neptune's temperatures. They followed the atmospheric temperatures since 2005 and expected them to slowly rise. What happened was surprise number one. The temperatures actually went back, dropped by 8 degrees until 2018. And after that followed surprise number two. And it was an even bigger surprise than the first one. The temperature increased sharply by 11 degrees until 2020. One of the scientists' statements said that no one essentially expected to see significant and rapid changes, and yet they were. Some of you might wonder why I'm telling you this. The reason is simple. There's a crucial message in this news story which I will return to later. But let me first deal with two issues. The first one is the energy crisis, and the second one, the carbon taxes. Most people see the energy crisis as a result of two factors, namely COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And while those two events definitely played a huge role on the latest sharp price increases, I see the main issue elsewhere. In my opinion, the energy crisis results from the destructive energy policies that are based on wishful thinking, unfortunately. And I'm talking, of course, about the political interventions aimed at the clean energy transition. To illustrate, let's make a quick thought experiment. Imagine that we wanted to fill our energy demand with wind turbines. We currently have an energy demand worldwide, globally, of about 620 exajoules. One wind turbine produces roughly, average, 21 terajoule. So if my calculations are roughly correct, then that would make it 30 million wind turbines we need. That's quite a few, I would say, but it doesn't end here. Now consider that for one wind turbine, we need 50 tons of copper. The global production in copper per year is 21 million tons, meaning that we could build in 1 year 400,000 wind turbines if we use all of the global production in copper just for wind turbines. In that case, we would need 75 years to make the energy transition. 75 years. And the problem is not just for wind turbines, it's similar for all kinds of renewable energies, just with other resources. So my first argument is that a timely clean energy transition is impossible because the resources are missing. And the resources can't be printed by any central bank like we do with money, especially the last two or 3 years. When we try to finance the transition to clean energies with new printed money, it is pretty clear what happens. The demand for the resources goes up, and the prices go up as well. Second, the renewable energies are unreliable. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and yet the electric grid needs a constant level of energy. When you rely on renewables, you also have to rely on some kind of energy where you can balance out these fluctuations in the electric grid. And the types of energy that are suitable for that are, what do you think? Coal? No, nuclear not. It's coal, it's gas, and it's oil. Nuclear takes far too long to put on and put off. So that doesn't work, unfortunately. So whoever is reliant on renewable energies to meet the energy demands is also reliant on fossil energy for energy security, unfortunately. And that could partly explain why the demand for fossil energy and the prices for fossil energy went up despite most governments making massive investments in renewable energy. Third, the demands on nature, they are substantial. That begins with land demands for renewable energy production, which is much larger than with conventional energy forms. And also, we should consider the often ignored effects on the environment. Wind turbines, for example, kill tens of millions of birds per year. And it's not the same birds that are killed by house cats, for example. These are the big birds that are sometimes going extinct, or at risk of going extinct. So that's a huge issue, unfortunately. And from an economic perspective, the land demands that renewable energies have lead to higher prices for lands. And fourth, this is the last argument I have, it is also probably the biggest reason for the energy crisis is that fossil fuels or fossil energy production is stagnating or even decreasing despite rising energy needs or demands. And that has a lot to do with government regulation, with government rules. Yeah, we already heard about fracking. Fracking is a good example for that. And we in Europe are in the worst spot in the energy crisis because here government interventions were the most extreme, unfortunately, and those made us very, very vulnerable. And the relatively decreased supply leads us to higher prices, for energy and especially for fossil energy. So to summarize, the economic effects of the clean energy transition are rising prices for some resources, land and energy. What we see in the energy crisis, of course, is exactly that. What would be free market solutions to the energy crisis? I don't know. And if I knew, we wouldn't need the market. You could just ask me. But what I know is this. The market is the best tool we have to make sure that there are many different approaches to problems or dealing with problems. And that is why we need a free market when it comes to energy. Away with all those rules and regulations that assume that somebody knows what's best. Let the market work. Maybe we need nuclear energy, maybe we need some more fossil energy, and possibly there will be an entirely new way of producing energy just a few years down the road. We don't know that, but to find out we need a market. And now on to the second part, which is carbon taxes. Most economists, unfortunately, cite the carbon taxes as one of the government's best tools to fight global warming or climate change, and I disagree. I think they can be very, very destructive, even though I consider climate change an issue that we have to deal with. Let me tell you why I think they are so destructive. The first reason is opportunity cost. For those who don't know the concept, the opportunity cost is the expected benefit of an action that is not chosen, or of the highest valued action that is not chosen. If the government intervenes with carbon taxes, for example, the effect is that people don't have the resources to treat or to tackle more pressing issues in the way that they should be treated. The question here is it a good idea for politicians to force people to act as if carbon emissions, for example, are the most important problem just because politicians think that it is? Another big issue that carbon or a carbon tax would lead to is that people would need more time for bureaucratic tasks. That doesn't only apply to the public sector, where it is the most obvious, but also for companies. If new taxes, for example, are implemented, there are processes that need to adapt it, there are projects that need to recalculate it, and it also usually means that you need to fill out more documents, and that's all time that otherwise could be spent productively. This way, of course, is just one way that taxes or government intervention leads to less wealth being created. Another factor is, for example, incentives. And if we create less wealth each year, then compared to a scenario without a carbon tax, that missing wealth can't be used, for example, to treat or to pay for adaptation strategies, for reversal strategies when it comes to dealing with climate change. And now combine that with the fact that a carbon tax is highly unlikely to be implemented in such a way or at such a level that would have any significant impact on climate change. And you can see that by implementing a carbon tax, we are putting future generations at a much worse spot when it comes to dealing with climate change, unfortunately. And closely related to that is the environmental Kuznets curve, which says that as economies get wealthier, at first they are producing more pollution, but after a certain point, despite getting wealthier, they are producing less pollution. If you want to imagine that in a graph, imagine that there's wealth on the x-axis, then there's pollution on the y-axis, and then the form of the graph would be an inverse U, the relationship between the two. So in other words, if economies are made less wealthy via carbon tax, it's quite likely that the effect would be more environmental pollution. And there is one scenario, this is my last point on the carbon tax, that would make a carbon tax even worse, and that's if it's implemented only locally, nationally, regionally. The effect of such a tax would be the relocation of industries to other countries. And let's think about which countries that would be. It would probably be the countries which don't have a carbon tax, and which countries can't implement a carbon tax. Well, the poorer countries, if they are implementing a carbon tax, they would impoverish their population in very short order, and that's why they probably won't implement such a tax. So the industries will go to these countries, and these are incidentally also the countries with less capital goods. And if this is true, then that could mean that the carbon intensity of production increases. So per production unit, there's more carbon emission. And a carbon tax implemented in that way would then possibly mean that we increase carbon emissions globally and not decrease it. And at this point, I want to come back to my first story about the temperatures on Neptune. The important message for me was, we are all fallible. We don't have perfect knowledge. We get surprised regularly. And that is even true for the most renowned scientist and for the most popular politician. That is why no one should have the power to decide what to do about the energy crisis, what to do about climate change, or any other problem we face. We need to learn to be more humble. We need a competition of ideas that is as unhindered as possible. In short, we need a free market. Thanks.
Mitja? Thank you, Martin. Economics point of view. Mitja, you also bring something similar in economic terms, probably. All right, go ahead, go for it, thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Mitja Steinbacher. I'm from Slovenia, working as a Dean of the Faculty of Law and Business Studies. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Juan, for the invitation. I was asked, actually, to discuss a little bit with you about the the cyclical economy with respect to how this interferes with the policies to handle the environmental issues. And what the speakers before me have actually expanded my framework of the thoughts that I wanted to say to you, and in particular with respect to a couple of essential preconditions if we want to talk about particular, let's say, policy issue, or in general, particular scientific issue as such, or research question. So we've heard about the data that Martin presented, or with his initial story about the temperature on the Neptune. So, while we actually on Earth are incapable of actually measure such a complex relationships as they actually appear in our environment. What I want to say, it's a lot of this is actually a data sensitive and very data dependent environmentalism as such is very data intensive field of study. And while on the other hand, we are very limited with our skills to acquire high quality data. What is actually a bottom line here is to be aware of the circumstances in which a particular measurement was taken, say the measurement of the air quality. If it's taken at some airport very close to where the airplanes are landing, that would show you a pretty large or alarming levels of certain let's say gases in the air, right, or pollutants in the air, if you can call them so. Well, on the other hand, if you would take a measurement in some forest, let's say, you would find a completely different story, right? So it really needs the whole community, actually, the research community and the awareness of the general public should be primarily focused on the reliability and our capacity to obtain really good and reliable data, which we are very far from at the moment. Even though there is a sort of an inclination, or somehow the belief even, or even a faith, sort of, like a belief in science that it's capable of solving the issue of let's say trying to stop certain let's say environmental phenomena from, or so. That's the first part. So we need to be aware of the high quality of the kind of the type of the data that we have. And even though there seems to be a consensus that the environment is actually heating up, and that it's largely due to the activities of humans. With respect to value creation, with respect to using very cheap and reliable and affordable, available energy resources, right? Even though we've been living in the extremely well, I mean, we are much more, as was pointed out by Yaron in his introductory speech, much more well off than our ancestors have ever believed, or they have ever imagined that they could have lived in such a wealthy environment. Despite all these facts, that we are living in the societies that are producing very incredible amounts of wealth every day, despite this all policy making that tries to go against this basic entrepreneurial spirit of our giants, that try to see through the opportunities, try to produce something of real value, and try to offer some reason to all of us, actually, to the society in general, to have higher expectations of our future life, to raise that have the impact on our quality of life. So it's the notion of the information abundance is false. Why? Even though we lived in era of easy and easily available, let's say, all kinds of information, what we actually have is a mess of information. We are actually lost in the information, and actually, large part of that goes to the let's say, centralization in a way, or somehow the involvement of governments into the educational systems that we are actually having. What I want to say here is that the centers of political power have joined forces with the centers of intellectual power in order to get a hold over some, let's say, general issues. And one particular, or let's say naturally, let's say compatible issue to address is the environment, which actually addresses all of us. So I'm not surprised that the environmental issues have gained such a momentum, because it's like a question that addresses every one of us. And we all want to live in a clean environment, right? We all want to live in an environment that produces wealth on one hand, and yet doesn't interfere in a negative way to the quality of environment, right? But let me ask you something. I wonder, what do you think about the quality of environment in which actually the world has been living since let's say 1990? Has it improved or deteriorated? What do you think? Has the quality of environment improved or deteriorated from 1990 until today in the world in general? Yes, it has improved. And how about the level of standard? How much more do we produce now than we produced in 1990? Way more. Way more. That's true even for Russia. You wouldn't believe. Russian environment is actually the same. They haven't deteriorated their own environment since 1990. And yet their standard of living increased by twofold roughly, or 2.5-fold. Russians, can you imagine that? Even Russians. So what would you say would and I started with the unreliable data, right? Okay, that's true. We have to be critical about the data that we have. And yet they are trying to, based on this same data, I have an impression, or the impression is being pushed through, that the environment is actually deteriorating all the time, right? So we have this notion of let's say, some sort of even a guilt is being produced out of that as a part of on behalf of the people, right? And that's basically without having a little bit closer look into the data that we do have, despite its reliability, right? But the data that we do have speaks just about what we just mentioned, right? How about China, for instance? We have this. We have seen all the whole evolution of Chinese economy from the really deep-rooted communist state that controlled everything to the still deep-rooted communist state that controlled everything, but with the flavor of free markets, right? They opened a little bit up their markets in order to somehow keep in power, because it was obvious for them that there is no other way. I mean, for the Communist Party at the time. And now it seems that as if China, or as if our Western economies are so-called importing. That's the argument that I hear a lot about. That we are importing the pollution from China, right? And my question to you is, what do you think how Chinese environment and economy have done from 1990 until today? It has worsened, that's true. the imprint on their, or the foothold over their environment has worsened for about roughly 100%. But how about their wealth? The Chinese are producing. How has that changed? As compared, if we compare Chinese standard of living in 1990 to the standard of living that they have today, we cannot make that comparison. Actually, it's hard to compute that, actually. Even more than 10 times. They were living on below $1,000. They were living on about $300, $400 in 1990s in today's value, or even less. I'm not sure about the data, actually, but it's like very low standard of living. But today, they have like 11, 12,000 per capita. You see? What's the difference? Like 15-fold the level of standard increased. And they roughly doubled the imprint on their economy. Why do you think is that happening? Why doesn't, what is the part of the equation that we are missing out here? What do you think? Are these like regulations? No. Tell about regulations in Russia, they will kill you. Right? Tell about regulations in China, they will kill you. The technology, it's entrepreneurs, right? Technology has done this. Invisible. It's invisible to us. But we have to look through the data to see that. We would see, okay, it has the Chinese now live in a worse environment as they lived in 1990. Yes, a little bit, perhaps, on aggregate. We started a discussion about this local characteristic of measurements, right? Where they take the measurement, it will measure, the sensor will measure the data, but only in its surroundings, right? Okay, you can get a satellite imagery and this more like macroscopic data also. Yes, you can get it. But you cannot get the fine data for the whole area, right? You cannot get that kind of a data that would tell you precisely what's going on with the environment. Okay, so they have like, let's say, or some sort of islands of polluted areas have emerged also in China. Yes, they have. They are having air issues in Beijing. They were having those before the Olympics, right? We all remember that, how they were tackling these in order to have this marathon taking place, because there were some people who didn't want to take part there. I mean, the sportsmen, right? But it's not a big issue, actually, if we think through the lens of the incredible improvement in the standard of living on one hand, and on the other hand, by acknowledging at the same time that it was technology that improved in relative terms so much that the Chinese environment didn't worsen so much at the end of the day. What would the Chinese environment look like if the structure, what do you think? What would the Chinese environment look like if the structure of the economy remained roughly the same? Or, I mean, this burden, average emission per dollar, if it remained the same today, until today, from 1990 until today, what would you think would happen with the Chinese environment? It wouldn't be habitable anymore, right? It would be like 3 times worse than it is now, or even more. That's what the really plain and simple data speaks. And no one talks about that. We are all worried about the melting of the icebergs there in the Antarctics. What if that's just a natural phenomenon that would have taken place in any way? We don't know that. These are really complex issues actually going on, right? So, and
can we start to conclude?
Yes. Thank you, Juan. So let me start by starting with the availability of the data, and ending with the importance of the technology and our awareness, actually, how to produce wealth with as low as resources as it can possibly, as it can go, right? By doing so, we are actually helping our environments, right? Much more than by following the regulatory standards which are imposed on the economic activity in our society. So that would be for let's say as a takeaway message from this short presentation or this short talk. Take care, try to see through the data as critically as it goes, and by being aware that we have limited capacity the people have limited capacity to understand the complex issues around us, and at the same time, this same applies also for the regulators, right? They are also subject to these same biases and incapacity to understand what's going on as all the rest of us. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Mitja. So we have a few minutes left for Q&A from the audience. I will start with perhaps Juan to start with some question while you're thinking about your questions. And Felipe over there has the microphone, so ask him to bring it over. One of the topics that we like to discuss a lot in the liberty movement sometimes is the problem of intellectual property. So we're talking about entrepreneurs being very innovative. We need them to innovate and create the solutions for society. We know that we have an environment, a legal environment that protects certain inventions and ideas. And there's all this, always this controversy whether that is rational or not. And I think that in this case, when we need so much innovation, and on the one hand, you could say, well, the IP can be a burden for innovation, and other people say the IP is actually the framework that facilitates innovation. Then there's the government, of course, because government is the one who actually manages that concept, arranges that social institution, right? So at this moment, it's not the place perhaps to go deeper into the concept of IP and that itself, right? But what is going on right now? What do you think is going on right now? What would we need to create more solutions? Because I'm thinking that should we strengthen IP so that entrepreneurs can actually be incentivized to do more innovation, or should we totally get rid of them so that they can go ahead and do it? What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think getting rid of IP would be both immoral and a disaster economically. I think there's no question that IP provides a strong incentive for entrepreneurs and for innovation. You know, dismantling a system that has worked so amazingly well over 200 years, since the beginning of really intellectual property regimes in the West in the late 18th century and into the 19th century, would be an unmitigated disaster. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know that IP has to be strengthened. It needs to be better protected from the government. And certainly better protected from politicians like Biden, who, you know, what was it, last year wanted to basically do away with IP in an emergency because of COVID. So these companies that did this amazing, innovative discovery of mRNA vaccines would be, basically that would be taken away from them and would be, you know, the incentive for future companies to do the same thing in an emergency would be driven down to zero, never mind in a non-emergency. So no, I think we probably have property right regimes that are about right. I'm sure there are experts who would say we need a tinker here, we need a tinker there. I don't think we need to move in either one of those directions.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at actually some kind of very standard reductionist kind of economics literature on innovation, then usually they take the patent data, right? And they want to correlate it with everything. So, but here, actually, in Estonia, we're in a country where we don't have that many patents, because a lot of our innovation takes place in IT sector. It's combining already kind of existing solutions, kind of bootstrapping. We have quite a different innovation model, and in my sort of general point is that there are diverse models of innovation. I've spent a considerable amount of my research time researching open source software development. which is a different model of innovation. So I'm not saying that this is the right one and another one is the wrong one, but there are two different approaches. And obviously there also, you cannot say that, that there are no rights. I mean, the core team in open source movement has very strong rights to the source code. It's not that anybody can come and sort of start modifying the source code. So you have concepts like copyleft and so on. So I would say that it has to be a diverse system depending on the specific ecosystem that you're operating in. Sometimes because of certain IP rights, the progress can be slow. Maybe some other system is more appropriate, and you have entrepreneurs and ways to earn revenue to make money in both systems. I mean, open source is not just volunteer movement. There are whole businesses built around it. They just earn revenue differently. They offer consulting on top of the services they provide and for free, which can be kind of, I talked before about public goods or semi-public goods provided by private means, and I think in some ways open source is a very good example of that.
I completely agree on that point. I will only comment on the economics view, not on the moral view. That's two different things in my opinion. But from an economic point of view, it is pretty clear that IP can't be the same in IT and in medicine. That's very, very different kind of areas. And what works in IT will very likely not work in medicine. So I think we have to distinguish between sectors here. And the only issue I have there, I don't trust the government to make a good distinction for the sectors. But yeah, what can you do?
My take on that would be, it's a good question by Juan, actually. It's the intellectual property seems to be an invention, which actually it's not, in a way that we all rely on the we say that it's a saying that goes like we are standing on the shoulders of giants, right? How we say, let's say, if you are, I'm now talking from the perspective of an economics researcher. I acknowledge someone else's intellectual property by citing his or her contribution in a paper that I want to publish, because it was not my idea, but it's someone else's idea, right? That's the way or that's the way science works, basically. But since we know that also science is under strong command of the government, we have all kinds of, let's say, relationships that form as a result of that, all different ways of monetization of this very principle and basic knowledge, which actually haven't existed before the governments of modern time, right? So I would support, or I'm in strong support of acknowledging or being intellectually honest in a way that someone recognize someone else's contribution to your idea. But how to use that kind of let's say, because it's like more like a moral, let's say, obligation to the author of the original idea or to the author of some thought, right? But how to address the contributions of different entrepreneurs to a particular product, that's a completely different story, and that's a completely different kind of a question. I don't know. Perhaps there are some courts of, or if we use the inventions, let's say so, of our ancestors long ago, basically, where these dispute resolutions actually emerged in trade. Perhaps we can find some sort of ideas there in order to address the issue of intellectual property in a more natural way, I would say. But I have no affirmative solution to that kind of question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions over there?
Good evening. It has been said that we have a lot of data that supports that government are doing the wrong thing, and they are, of course, for maybe centuries denying good solutions for entrepreneurs, and even the society is kind of agreeing on that, since we have almost all the governments in the world doing that, from the most authoritarian governments for the most democratic governments. My question is, how do we change that in the era of post-truth, when the data doesn't mean so much and people are not really caring about what is real or not? How do we change this reality?
I don't think you can. So maybe the most important fight that we have is a fight against the post-truth era, right? We need to get beyond post-truth. If there is no such thing as truth, if it's all political and it's all power, then power will win and freedom loses. Freedom depends on the existence of objective reality and objective truth, and we need to fight for that existence, even when it might not be politically, in the narrow sense, in our interests to do so. But you know, in many respects, the battle for freedom is an epistemological battle about what is truth and is there truth. And you know, post-truth means anything goes. It's all about power. It's all about emotion. It's all about convincing large groups of people to do something. And we know what happens when you get demagogues trying to convince large groups of people to do something in the name of anything but truth. Right?
Actually, if I may add some, actually just came through the experiment, so to say, of this post-truth era through the COVID pandemic, right? So it was basically introduced to the power what Yaron just mentioned. So the power won in this particular case, right? So let's see what happens. We have to fight for as objective data as there is possible to get, and for as unbiased way of understanding this kind of, let's say, the reality which is there and unknown to us. We have to seek through our capacity to find answers to the existing questions by this elementary, let's say, human, elementary respect towards what's true and what's not.
Yeah, probably the biggest victim of COVID is truth. It's respect for the truth, respect for objective knowledge, respect for science, real science, not politicized science, and that is a virus that's going to be very difficult to find an antidote to. It's much worse than anything COVID can inflict on us.
And when it comes to environment, at least we're talking about data that has a veneer of respectability so far. It's not a social issue. COVID is also a medical thing that is technical in a sense. But data, like Mitja was discussing about the data we're collecting around the world, all that, we still respect that because it's supposed to be data, okay? But in this world, it's mathematics, if you want. But recently, mathematics is starting to be told in America as an issue of racial injustice, and you know, how do you see mathematics from your racial perspective and oppression situation? So soon we will have also the temperatures of the Earth from the point of view: are you white or black? You know, when you look at them. So
even that data, right? I mean, so the data, the raw data is there, but all data ultimately needs to be interpreted in some way. As you mentioned, is it close to an airport? Is it in the middle of a city? Is it in, and how you adjust, and the algorithm and the models that they build are all susceptible to political manipulation. And we've seen, if you remember, that email dump of the climate change scientists, and kind of how they were talking about politicizing the data and taking the data and manipulating. And then you get an IPCC report that is 3,000 pages long that basically nobody reads. What they read is not even the shortened version, which is a few hundred pages long. What they read is the press release. The press release has nothing much to do with the 3,000 pages because it's purposefully sensationalized in order to get publicity, because that's the job of a press release at the end of the day. So people who actually read the IPCC report say, okay, the climate's changing, but it doesn't look like the UN scientist thinks it's a disaster. But if you read the press release, it looks like it's a catastrophe, and you know, Greta is running things. So you know, science is constantly being manipulated and constantly being used. Even when the scientists are trying to do a good job, others are manipulating the data in order to politicize everything.
Yeah, on that, especially in the environment science, the mathematical models they use there, they're kind of funny in parts, because, for example, the social cost of carbon, there's an assumption in every model what the social cost of carbon is. And that could be something like $50 per ton of carbon, or $20, or some studies even find that the social cost of carbon is negative, so that there's a social benefit of carbon, because there's areas that become inhabitable because of global warming. So yeah, exactly. It's not that easy. But mostly when you want to sensationalize something, you just pick assumptions that you want for the later conclusion. It's not real science, unfortunately, what happens with mathematical models.
I'm not convinced even that the social cost of anything is a meaningful concept.
Yeah.
I don't know what the social cost of
Exactly.
means.
Right. I have a question, yeah. Thank you very much for sharing today. My question is about the alternative sources of energy. And I'm not an energy expert, but I come across once the biomass. And I was just wondering, like, where do you see like biomass and maybe like waste, because I believe there's a lot of waste, how that can become a source of alternative energy, and which place can it take, like in all the different other classes? Thank you.
I unfortunately haven't looked into that, into the data before, so I can only guess there. But yeah, with biomass, you just burn that you, basically it's just net zero. But also you have to keep in mind that if you cut trees and then burn them, the trees can't put up CO2 or carbon from the atmosphere. So I'm not that convinced that that would be a great solution.
It's a very small, very small percentage of the energy mix today. And the risk of burning, for example, waste in landfills it results in other pollutants, right? Because you're burning all kinds of stuff, and all kinds of stuff is going into there, and it's very hard to clean, and it becomes quite expensive once you start trying to filter it all out and make sure that it's not pollution. There's no easy solution to alternative energy, and there certainly is not going to be an easy solution without freeing up entrepreneurs and creating the right kind of incentives for entrepreneurs to go out there and think about it. So there's people investing heavily in fusion, but by everything I know, fusion is like 50 years in the future. It's nowhere near. There's Therion reactors that people are talking about. So there's a lot of people talking about, in the venture capital community is spending billions of dollars investing in different ideas around alternative energy, and the solution will come from them. It won't come from a panel up here, right? It won't come from central planners, even good ones. And what we need is to create an environment where the government is not picking winners and losers, and where it's venture capitalists who are picking winners and losers, because they're much more qualified to do so, and where there's real experimentation. So the way venture capitalists pick winners and losers, on the one hand, they choose to invest in some companies and not in others. They get the better ideas. But on the other hand, they invest in 10 companies knowing that only one will be successful, right? So they're willing to take that kind of risk, where they're willing to spread out the money, and they don't know exactly which one. They don't know which one of the 10 would be successful. If they knew, they'd only invest in that one, right? But a government would never do that, and nobody else can do that. That's the beauty of venture capital. So what we need is to encourage more, entrepreneurship within the energy sector, and not predispose ourselves to what is renewable and what is acceptable and what is where we should be investing. Let people's imaginations, you know, let them rip, let them go out there and try things.
My own general take is as well that, I mean, if you're talking about alternative sources of energy, then the energy mix is the key. So you want to have lots of different sources. You want to have lots of experimentation. However, what we often seen that we have those sort of fads, right? I mean, you know, here in Estonia, we used to be very much dependent on oil shale. You know, some 10 years ago, it was seen as a sort of not just economic issue, but kind of like energy security issue, because to the great extent we were also, you know, at that time net exporters of the energy. We were kind of energy independent. I think lots of investments that could have been made into alternative sources were not made. Now we see this bubble of hydrogen, right? So we have some companies here who lobby very actively. You have in the parliament, you have this sort of hydrogen kind of support groups and so on. You know, I don't know if it will work or not. Some are skeptics, some are optimistic. We should experiment. So in addition, you know, some of you know one of our alumni, Kalev Kallemets, he's CEO and founder of Fermi Energia, which tries to bring a small nuclear power plant to Estonia. So he has raised private money, you know, around the world. Also, I think the current government is more favorable. Obviously, it's a complex, there's a lot of uncertain issues and so on, but it will take time. I mean, Kalev promises electricity at very good prices, but it will materialize at best at 2030. So what should I do with my house so far? I mean, I could use cheaper electricity to heat it, but at the moment I'm heating my house with natural gas, which comes from Russia. Hopefully, we are able to, you know, now provide it by some other means through LNG terminal that hopefully also will be ready by fall. So you see, there is a lot of uncertainty and complexity, and I think the best response is a lot of entrepreneurial activity, experimentation. So
why don't you? Why aren't you importing natural gas from Norway? Seems closer.
I think in form of LNG, we will in the end have a different sources, but there is no pipeline. Yeah. But in general, the Nordic energy market is kind of more or less connected. We have, you know, what also happens in Norway kind of influences us, but of course there are sort of transmission issues and all kind. Yeah, so it's kind of connected, but maybe not sufficiently enough. So it's kind of tricky. In that sense. But yeah, the bottom line is a lot of things are possible, but it just takes time. And I guess there was even plan to have this LNG terminal in Estonia something like 5-6 years ago when Taavi Rõivas was a prime minister, but then they decided with Finns that it will be built in Finland, but of course Finns never did it. So, so it's again kind of like political economy of it is slightly strange sometimes. But now they have this determination to do it here in Paldiski. So, but we'll see.
And Kalev's actually greatest problem that you mentioned about the plants, the nuclear plants. Mm. He needs 10 years just to go through regulation.
Exactly.
So it's not about technology or distribution or whatever. It's the regulation that he has all the hurdles.
Yeah. Sure.
And that's how government can really help innovation, is just get rid of the regulation or streamline it dramatically, particularly with nuclear. The whole world should be moving towards nuclear power. You know, how are you going to create the electricity for electric cars if we don't go to nuclear? I mean, it's all fantasy otherwise. So, and small micro nuclear power plants is probably, again, I'm no central planner, but probably the solution to this. But for that, you have to get rid of massive amounts of regulations all over Europe and all over the United States.
Actually, it's a really appalling, or in a way somehow striking, that the governments all over the rich world, actually the developed world, have managed to cause the crisis in such abundant and easily available commodity as the oil, right? It's like they have managed, now they are talking about the energy crisis, and they are, which is actually being presented as a side result of the war in Ukraine on one hand, and of the COVID recession on the other. But this is altogether basically a real regulatory mess that has pushed this elementary commodity basically almost out of the existence to the point of being unwanted commodity, right? Which is basically really ununderstandable from the principles of Economics 101, which were presented by your rector a couple of minutes ago. So it's like unimaginary for our ancestors if you mentioned them, if you were able to talk to them who invented all this, or to the Rockefeller family, for instance, what has come out of this, of their solution, they wouldn't be able to believe that. I'm almost sure.
I'd like to add a comment related to something about China, and then I will follow with a question. So I grew up in China, and I can confirm that just from my own limited observation, I didn't travel around, right? So in my city, there's a channel, no, not river, but a channel, right? So when I was really, really young, there were fish inside. Well, real fish, right? Then when I was kind of in primary school, the pollution got really, really bad. So the river got really smelly for a reason, and chemicals, people dumping, stuff like that, and there's no fish and smelly. And I left China, and my experience has been for the last more than decades that I have left China, the fish is coming back. It's getting cleaner, so that's the data points I can give. So that's a confirmation that it's a inverse U curve, right? I also want to add to that is what actually happened when I was young. Although unfortunately I don't quite know how the legal system works, but what we do notice a lot from the news at that time was the villagers who was a victim of the pollutions, right? External factors, what externality we call, right? So they were the victims. They were grouped together, organized by, of course, by the lawyer. I don't know if they're private, or I don't know how the legal system works, but definitely there's lawyer involved. So they will do a class action, right? This is called, right? So they'll sue the companies. There are two types of companies: private, because those are the vibrant ones. Those are easy target. Government said, no, private company, let's make sure that the villagers get their rights back. But then you have the semi-public ones. Those are the corruption case. So they got money from local government. Those are the ones usually harder to actually crack down. And those are usually on the newspaper you would see longer cases, because then the government were involved. It's can become corruption case. But for the more pure private one, those are the ones that actually got sued much easier, right? So that's kind of my observations. I might be missing some points, but that's kind of thing that I can share. What I'd like to follow a question, perhaps in relation to that, is the Green New Deals. You have the United States forms, and you have Europe, the Green Initiative, what is it called? So from that observation I made about China, right, when the government involved, whatever institutionalized infrastructure they build is very hard to, if they do actually damage to the environment, they are kind of harder to go against, because somehow government is involved. That's just my observation. I guess it's a bit loaded question. I guess my question is, do you think the Green New Deal would have some potentially some danger to actually the environment, in some way? Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, I think it would be a disaster, because I mean the main thing of Green New Deal, the American Green New Deal, and I think ultimately the European one, if it was taken seriously, I don't think anybody takes it seriously. I don't think anybody will actually execute. Maybe the Germans, but nobody else will. Is that it'll make us all poorer. It will literally be wealth destroying. And as we get poorer, we're willing to tolerate more pollution. We're willing to tolerate, for the sake of a little bit more wealth, we're willing to tolerate dirt. So cleanliness is a feature of wealth. As you get wealthier, you get cleaner, the U curve, right? And if you start moving in the other direction, it will be a disaster on every single front. The more they take it seriously, the more disastrous it will be.
Yep, like as with any central planning, obviously there is a very strong risk of sort of misallocating funds and spending it on the wrong things. You know, when I was really young, I was working as an intern, as a summer intern at the Cato Institute in the US. And with Ian Vasquez, he was writing a book, and I was helping him about the activities of the World Bank at that time, and just sort of give some historical examples. And sort of typical thing is that you give money to some huge projects in India, for instance, and then they will build some kind of new dam and a river or whatever, and that sort of leads to the environmental disaster. And now they have a reason to give again a new grant to India to fix the problems that the previous project has caused. And you know, this is kind of like I think the name of the book was actually Perpetuating Poverty, or it's kind of like perpetual circle, you know. It goes on. So obviously there are, you know, risks with that type of more centralized approach.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with both Yaron and Meelis. The thing is that I think we should distinguish between environment and climate, because they are too often mixed together. And as I see it, the Green New Deals mostly focus on climate, and it's just about renewable energy. And I fear that by focusing so much on the climate and renewable energies, that we are sacrificing the environment to save the climate. That's my fear.
Very interesting.
Hello, over here. Thanks, guys. First of all, for your talks, and a question. We have a title of this event: Energy and Environmental Challenges and Entrepreneurial Solutions for these. I believe there's a bit of a consensus on this stage that the governmental solutions are helping less and hurting more, in terms of, even in Estonia, if you buy a house more than I believe 200 and something square meters, you have to install sun panels, which is a very reasonable idea to do here. But maybe you guys can give an example of where the government has actually provided any solutions for these problems. And specifically to Mr. Brook, you advocate for an embargo for Russian oil, gas, and perhaps all other goods as well. How does that correlate with your general principle that the government shouldn't intervene, as embargo is a governmental action, that the government shouldn't intervene in the economics? Thank you.
So with regard to the principle, the job of the government is to protect individual rights. That's its primary responsibility. It should not intervene in the economy qua economy, but it should intervene when rights are violated. Rights of your own citizens, rights of your own people. Russia is a threat to the individual rights of everybody in Europe today. It's manifest threat we're seeing in Ukraine, and you see it in the rhetoric coming out of Russia that Ukraine is not necessarily the last place they would like to inflict pain on. And therefore it is the government's job to protect you from the Russians. That's their job, right? Whether they can do it in Estonia or not, that's a different question. But that's their job, right? And then part of that is to make sure that you accidentally or in whatever way are not helping the Russians. You're not assisting them in their wish to destroy you and their wish to violate your rights. And trade is win-win. Every time you trade with a Russian benefits. You benefit too, but Russia benefits. And therefore I think that when you identify an enemy, and I think there are very few real enemies in the world right now, but when you identify an enemy, in its role of protecting individual rights, a government can say, you can't work with the enemy. You can't benefit the enemy. You can't trade with the enemy. And that means no trade. That's why I don't believe in limited sanctions. We pick and choose. We choose which oligarchs are the bad guys and which oligarchs are not bad guys. One wonders what motivates that kind of choices in politics. Who's gotten money from whom. Rather than doing that, Russia's out, right? Russia is right now, the idea that we have embassies in Russia and we treat them as we sit in the Security Council in the UN with Russia, we treat them as a normal country, and yet they've just invaded another country and the pariah of the world. Well, if they're really a pariah, then we should cut them off. Now, look, I don't advocate for right now Europe boycotting Russia. You can't. Realistically, in the real world, you can't do it. But you should really be thinking about how you got into a situation where something that is not nuts, them invading Ukraine, was not science fiction, how you let that happen and how you let your dependency on them become the way it is. And I think, again, the solution is diversity, and the way you get diversity is by opening up markets. And with regards to, has government ever done anything good in terms of energy? I'd say the only thing is the protection of IP, and generally the protection of property rights when it has done so. But in terms of anything more than, and I'm sure government has funded some basic research that has led to something good. But government crowds out private funding of basic research. I don't really count that as a real good. So the answer is no, government has not done anything.
Yeah, to what governments did good. Many years ago, when they stayed out of the energy market, that was good.
But in general, actually, it's the government. Why the government shouldn't interfere with our not only economic affairs, but in general, why it should protect us from violence rather than serve us as a goods provider, right? Is because what the government or the political system actually installs some regulation or some decision, the decree that applies to everyone, basically. So they have this strong power. They have a scepter in their hands, which they can use to change the whole society basically overnight. That's exactly what happened during the COVID, right? They transformed our societies overnight, basically. So that's why they are so dangerous on one hand. While on the other hand, they have to be, in a way, strong protectors of our rights to be defended from the government, not to be assisted by the government. The citizens should be defended from the violence of the government towards their own citizens. And installing the energy dependency is according to my perspective, a sort of a violence from the government, right? If you take a look at this issue as the issue of having the energy available, which was actually provided by the markets very efficiently, and now being taken away by the governments by force. That's the violent act, actually, by definition.
Thank you. We're running out of time.
Last question.
Well, one last question, perhaps necessary over there. Please.
Thank you. I've noticed an interesting trend that when I speak to or meet companies that has been raising funds from VCs, they are more socialist and ideological. And the companies who have been trying to do the business as a kind of raw thing, they are more competitive, more disciplined, and it feels like there are multiple ways how you can run entrepreneurship. So it's really nice when you have the fund that is giving 200 startups money, and today everybody wants to raise funds, not to do the business. I want to raise some money, and so on and so on. So do you see this type of business as a problem for future, where the founders are raising money but kind of not doing the business in a traditional way?
I mean, I think you're going to see a lot of different models out there, and it's good to see a diversity of models. I don't quite agree with you that venture capitalists funded companies necessarily are more socialist. I don't have that experience in Silicon Valley necessarily. I'll also say that almost all truly successful companies that have reached scale, the unicorns of the world, are almost all venture funded. I think venture capital provides enormous value to entrepreneurs and to founders, and the model has worked beautifully to date, but it's not the owner model, right? And particularly today in software, where it's not capital intensive. You don't need a lot of capital in order to start a company today. It's one of the beauties of the last 10 years is companies can start, you can start it with a few $100,000 or even less than that, because it's a bunch of programmers and you're writing code. You're going to find different models, different ways in which to fund these things. Serial entrepreneurs funding themselves off of the exit of the past. SpaceX could not have been funded by venture capitalists. It's too much of a guaranteed failure, right? The assumption has to be that it will fail. Without Elon Musk, or the same with what's his name, something Blue. Blue Virgin couldn't have been venture capital funded. It had to be people who've made a huge amount of money funding their own projects. So you're going to find multiple models, multiple ways in which to fund these kind of ventures, and that's the beauty of freedom. Is there is no one way to do things, and indeed the best ways, the superior ways, will be more successful than other ways, but there'll be always a diversity of ways to do things.
I think also in venture capital you see different firms, different models. I mean, you have some firms that are more purpose-driven. For instance, when I speak with some of our alumni who operate in education technology companies, have been very successful. They usually say that, oh, they're trying to avoid traditional venture capital firms because they are sharks, and they go more to the the ones that are willing to stay with them for a longer time, because education, well, moves slowly. It's not like finance or fintech, so it doesn't move as fast than some other sectors. So I think that's the result. I agree basically there is a diversity, and obviously if you look at the history, you see that a lot of entrepreneurs also have been socialist. I mean, Arm & Hammer and so on. I mean, so that's the life.
Thank you. We're going to close. I would like to thank the panel for being here. It's been a long trip, I know, complicated trip. Thanks to the audience here for being here today. I think that we'll learn something here. I think that it's something to bring home and think about, and to also to tell other people that there are alternatives to government solutions. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you keep in touch with the Center for Free Economic Thought. We have a Facebook site, and we can get in touch there or talk to me, and keep in touch. Send me questions. Keep the debate. And thank you very much, everybody. Take care.